Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
And welcome back, everybody. We're going to kind of dissect business and what that looks like in the technology sector. He's somebody that has a company that does just that, from medical to software to propulsion engineering, all of that. Spacewell Technology. Do I have that name right?
Spacewell Technologies. Yeah, you got it, Steve.
Cool. I was actually going by memory. I don't have it up on a screen or anything like that.
Oh, great.
But I know he's Jackson Pleis, and he's back with us. He's the gentleman behind that and more. How you doing today?
Thanks for having me, Steve. You know, it can be stressful, get a lot of ups and downs in this, owning your own business kind of thing. It's got its perks and it's also got its drawbacks, definitely. And right now I'm dealing with one of the drawbacks. In fact, if you ever try to raise money or secure funding, some of the things that you have to provide is bank statements for the business and all sorts of different things along those lines. And if you're having any sort of issues with any of your clients or anything like that, where you're having, late payments and all of this stuff, luckily, not just this country, but generally, majority of first world countries at least have some sort of court systems that have limits in place for how much you can basically claim or go after. And there's things like small claims courts as well as the Supreme Court. And these things can become extremely costly with attorney fees and all of this stuff. It just can become a big nightmare. And so you end up negotiating. And if it just doesn't work out, then unfortunately, sometimes the next step is to actually start the court process, which unfortunately can delay all the sort of fundraising and all that kind of stuff that I've been trying to do recently to work on some of the projects that we had talked about, in some of the earlier shows around clean energy stuff in particular. I've got some really great ideas on designing an engine that runs on liquefied natural gas, converts the liquefied natural gas into a gaseous form. The gaseous form would then be put into a really high temperature, high pressure situation, which will break the methane molecules apart into hydrogen, carbon, solid carbon. Some portion of the hydrogen would be deuterium statistically, and that can be enhanced with plasmas and different types of lasers and things along those lines to increase the free neutrons and protons in the system. There's a lot of really amazing stuff I would like to work on, and so all of this can kind of hold those projects up, which is why I started the Everything Space Whales Shopify store and a few other means to sort of bridge the gap between these, invoices of, larger R&D work that I do as well. So along with that, I've looked at maybe potentially buying like an auto mechanic shop in order to, work on cars in the meantime, as well as build a lab inside there. And the beauty of that is, auto mechanic shops are already listed in a moderate hazard, typically occupancy rating for the areas that you work in, because there's high pressure, high temperature, high voltage plasmas, very similar to the R&D work I do. However, it's obviously much more constrained and tested and been engineered instead of the prototypes I've done in the past. However, it allows me to have a space to sort of work on these things. And unfortunately, that's sort of held up at the moment. And that can be quite frustrating at times. So hopefully, these podcasts sort of get the word out there of what I'm trying to do and what I want to do. And hopefully there's support in that and make this less of an issue.
With this company, what's the current situation without going into detail, but specifically, like what's going on there?
They've had a lot of turnaround. Like this is not the first issue I've had with them, and in fact, it's all safety related. It has nothing to do with anything that was done improperly or any causable type of issues. It actually spawns straight down to that they've been hiring people that have not had experience in this specific subject. And if you're going to be working on these type of systems, they are large industrial systems. They get extremely hot, in some cases upwards of over 1,000 Kelvin. You're flowing flammable gases through them, and in some cases you're working with pure oxygen. Luckily for myself, I started working with pure oxygen when I was like in middle school, high school with oxyacetylene welding. However, working with pure oxygen, for example, is extremely dangerous because if you don't do everything right, you can have an oxygen fire. Oxygen fires are extremely dangerous. And because they actually burn basically everything. So if you're feeding oxygen through a series of tubes, for example, stainless steel even, and you don't do enough involvement on cleaning the burrs and making sure all the machining is done perfectly, you'll actually create a oxygen fire if you flow oxygen through it from the friction of the molecules of the oxygen speeding over the burrs of the metal. And then it gets even worse if there's leftover unburnt hydrocarbons. So if you used an oil to cut the metal tubing, for example, and did not remove all the oil residue, the oil will interact with the oxygen and then cause an oxygen fire. And the tricky part with an oxygen fire is it will consume the metal as the fuel. So the metal will actually start burning because it has an oxygen source, an oxidizer source. So they become extremely difficult to put out because you can't use the normal means of putting out a regular fire that you would use with a regular fire extinguisher and things like that. So there's all this training and all of these things that you have to have known. And, instead they hired up a lot of people that had zero experience with it. I came up there and was like, hey, you can't do this. And sure enough, they had an oxygen fire right where I was telling them all of these problems. And they actually took it more like I was the bad guy for it when, I was really looking out for their safety. And then I've had more problems with that recently where it's sort of all related. We had this big issue with the crowdsource thing, right? One bad piece of code ruined all sorts of, processors all over the world for a period of time and stopped it up. And so, when you control these large things, run power plants, refining processes, the software that's written to control them has to be done in very logical way, and it should be done with somebody that has done systems like this, or at least had some training in the programming language that you're going to program it in. And I found that was a huge flaw. They had broken a lot of parts and not getting results. And so I said, look, I'll rewrite the whole thing, and it'll only take me a few days because I've done 10 years worth of this stuff. I know it took you guys a few months to write it, but it'll take me a few days. So let me rewrite it really quick, and then I'll come up and test it, and I'll feel much safer about it, especially with liabilities, because I'm my own entity as well. So I would then be putting my name and my liability on the test essentially. So I was like, no, let's make sure everything is safe and good before we fire this thing up. And so it was just a huge red flag for them, another safety issue. And it's just like, I'm not gonna work with a company that's not gonna take the safety aspect seriously, because this is what's ultimately what happens is you end up in some sort of lawsuit. So
Wow.
Yeah, definitely frustrating, but it's just part of the job sometimes, unfortunately. And I've actually worked with a lot of consultants, in my past, working for companies. And I remember him. I actually worked with this funny electrical engineer that would actually go audit fires. So if there was a large fire at like a marijuana distribution facility or electrical fire at someone's house, the insurance company would hire him to go investigate with the fire department to determine what the cause of the fire was and whether or not the insurance company would pay out the policy, essentially. And so he was always telling us stories about how these fires would get started from somebody putting their bare hand on a bulb that heats up like a weed growing facility, and then the bulb gets hot and ignites the oil hydrocarbons in your skin that got imprinted onto the bulb and then start the fire. Or other problems of people plugging surge protectors into surge protectors to extend the cable. And then a big, huge one has been the electric cars. So if you live in an apartment that doesn't have a updated charging grid, and you're like, I'll just use the 120, extension cord and run it out the wall, fire department will show up and, you'll get in trouble, and they'll tell you not to do that, and all of these things. Sort of goes back to the question you had asked me before the show. What new technologies have I seen recently? Well, actually, one that we have already talked about, Steve. If you remember early on, I sort of talked about how we could build roads that had electrification built into them to basically charge electric vehicles as they drove along. Well, that has happened. So Norway has produced the first part of, I believe, public road section that as electric vehicle charging as it goes along.
Wow.
Uh,
I
yeah.
can't imagine the expense of that. Again, what we're talking about here is as a car drives, it's being charged. Like amazing, fantastic.
Yeah.
But
It's called near field charging, essentially. You have to create a large magnetic field in order to induce a charge along a circular coil pack. And maybe you've seen them on the back of your phones, maybe a little
yes,
outline. Yeah, same type of technology. Imagine putting one of those on the bottom of the car attached to the battery, right? And so as you're driving along, if you have this large magnetic induced field through the road as the car passes along that circuit conducts current and charges the vehicle. Yeah, and you're totally right. I don't know what the inefficiencies are, how many cars need to be on it at a time to make sure that it's just not constantly losing electricity. I will mention, though, that Norway in particular in the last, call it 10 years at least, maybe a little bit further back than that, is one of the leading countries in producing R&D and technologies for clean energy space in particular. The reasoning behind it might surprise you, Steve. It actually has to do with Norway's, let's say, less clean history. Norway is one of the original largest countries of oil production, and they have one of the largest sea ships and marine vessels of any countries around the globe. And they realized around 10 years ago, after looking at climate data, when global warming, global climate change started to become more of a scientific, study, essentially, Norway was like, wow, we're a big problem. We're one of the causes of all of this, right? Essentially is what they said. They said, wow, all of this mining for these, our fossil fuels that we have, extraordinary amounts of, and, these huge cargo ships and these huge shipping, just lots of sulfur pollution, lots of carbon monoxide pollution, nitrous oxide pollutions come from these things. So what they did, many years ago is they created what's called the Sovereign Fund. So the Sovereign Fund, and 10 years ago, they had basically funded it with proceeds and the profits that they had made from the oil industry in the years, and they actually funded it with $1 trillion. So that was like 10 years ago. So who knows, how much they've spent of it or how much more they've put into but essentially 10 years ago, Norway said, no, we were the problem. Let's try and fix the problems. And so let's invest the profits that we made from it into technologies such as reducing sulfur. So I worked on a project briefly we were interested to see if we could remove the sulfur oxides being produced from burning what's called bunker C fuel. Bunker C fuel is this really kind of crude oil that is extremely cheap because it hasn't really been refined very much. However, so ships' motors, large cargo ships, are designed to run on this bunker C fuel. However, it produces a lot of horrible emissions, specifically the sulfur. So years ago, they remandated it. So as the cargo ships get closer to port or closer to shore, they switch over to natural gas or diesel, depending on how their motor operates. So when they get closer to shore, then they're not producing all the sulfur and all these emissions. So I worked on a project where we tried to actually remove the sulfur before it went out the exhaust stack and accumulate it as an elemental sulfur. And then you could actually sell the sulfur at the port as a commodity. So we did like pressure swing absorption, and I was sitting in a lab dissolving dimethyl thiophene into diesel to add sulfur concentrates to pour it into a generator to burn it, to then pressurize it, to then pull it out, to run it through a catalytic event, to hydrate, all of these things. It works. It was just not exactly the most efficient way of doing it potentially. And instead of investing a lot of money into like adding these systems onto all these ships to remove the sulfur to continue running bunker C, they were kind of just like, I guess we just won't run bunker C fuel anymore. So there's still these possibilities for these technologies to use some of these older fuel sources and energy sources, as long as we can implement systems that, reduce or almost eliminate completely the harmful part that's emitted out of them. So, I truly believe, and having worked in this industry, that large scale combustion and even automotive combustion, done with proper tuning, done with the most advanced catalytic systems, done with proper engine management, done with proper airflow control and fuel flow control, the amount of emissions that are really produced is so little compared to the rest of the world that are stuck burning these fossil fuels in these old power systems or these old refinery systems that they never cared about the emissions way back when they were built. So
It surprises me, Norway. I would think that they would be a country that's very environmentally sensitive, very particular about all of that. I'm kind of surprised, gotta tell you.
Yeah, actually, I mean, if you like Netflix, there's I believe there was a series of about Thor, basically, in the modern day, and they sort of hit on it actually, and I believe it was even filmed there, but they basically show that how all these large companies from way back when, did all these kind of shady things, and like in the show they hide a lot of this like waste in a cave, and they have a lot of cave systems because of the huge mountains they have. And so they had put all of this nasty stuff because, 50 years ago, the regulations were different, right? So 50, 60 years ago, putting that stuff inside of a big cave was like, oh, that's what we do. We'll just seal it up in there, and, no one will go inside, and we'll put, signs, and then 60 years later, it's leaking out of the holding canisters that it's in, and then it's seeking into the water, and then people are getting sick from the water, drinking the tap water essentially. So they made this whole series around it, and not that it's based on a true story or anything, but the concept is similar, where it's like, yeah, actually Norway was top 5 most oil producing countries early on. So like I said, it really wasn't until about 10 years ago where Norway was like, oh yeah, never mind, we've done this badly for the planet, let's try and do the opposite. So what most people have seen is Norway saw the climate change happening early on and changed their ways and dumped a lot of money into trying to solve the problem. So to everybody, it looks like Norway has been one of the leading frontier countries in producing clean energy, because they actually have been since they noticed the problem. And I have to give them credit, because once they saw the problem, they said, oh man, we're part of the problem, let's try and fix it. And that's what it really takes. It takes every single country around the globe to do that. And luckily for them, they had all the profits from doing it to reinvest it into the clean energy space now. But that's really what's needed. And so it is good to say Norway has been working on it and moving in the right direction, and doing the research and development. And another thing is, they also have natural resources that they can use for energy processing, geothermal heating, and things like that as well. So they're really kind of in an ideal situation to push on it, which is great. And one of the reasons that I had brought up the shipping industry in particular is having worked with them and knowing about the Sovereign's Fund, and knowing what they've been working towards, and then obviously seeing them recently put the road out there that we had talked about just a couple of weeks ago is pretty ironic. And I have some heritage from there, and my uncle spent time there while he was studying overseas and stuff, so be interesting.
What do you feel, Jackson, is something that we, in terms of technology, truly need? I mean, we'll laser, only got a couple of minutes left here, but what do you think is the next big thing? This is what we need to work on. Yeah,
I mean, as far as the U.S. is concerned, it's the infrastructure and the power grid system, right? Those two government funded, or if you will, subsidized programs we're the oldest everywhere. The benefit, there's downsides with that and benefits to that. So the downside is that now that it's so old, as everyone's noticed, the roads, potholes, all of it is, bridges in my area have failed and had to be, part of it is material science has gotten a lot better. Part of it is, engineering's changed, but, and the other part is, some of these, Seattle in particular was never developed to hold as many people as it has now. So the roadway systems are old, the bridges and then the power grid system, new countries, they don't put the power grids, above our heads anymore because they're like, look how much we spend on sending crews out there to fix the power lines during inclement weather. So it's like a little hindsight is, oh yeah, let's bury all of this or put it into the grid, put it into the roadway systems. And then obviously healthcare has been a huge problem for me in particular, having 4 surgeries, being in the hospital for a week after the last one, and then having to give myself antibiotics. It's just, the way our healthcare system doesn't really make sense. It's changes over on January 1st. So why January 1st? Oh, it's the new year. But that's not how life works. Life doesn't work based on what day it is. And then, like me in particular, breaking my ankle and pulverizing it on December 31st meant paying the total insurance for 2 years in 2 days. So it's like, just because that's some easy day to pick doesn't really necessarily make it an arbitrary, like.
I totally agree with you. And even the many states have the insurance marketplace where you're forced to get your insurance through the marketplace. That's there's a lot of good reason for that if you're getting credits from the state because of your income. Okay. Right. But if you're buying your insurance straight out and you're getting nothing from the state, why are you being hijacked? Why can't you shop around? There's no shopping around. It's like,
yeah, I know they limit it. It's like, how much do you make? And then it's like, here's your choices.
Right. That's that. Yeah. Well, okay. Well, there's a lot of insurance companies out there, and that's the only one that you offered. And
or like, what if that's the most important thing for you? Like medications and keeping yourself sane. What if you don't care how much insurance costs and you would pay for the most expensive insurance, even if it was 50%? I mean, not that, I would love doing that, but it's a good, valid point. I mean, they don't even give you the option to, see the doctor you want to see based upon your income.
That, I never thought of it that way. You're given 3 choices and maybe 4. And if you're not getting credits from the state, you're paying all in.
Right.
Why can't you just get whatever you want?
Right. There's thousands of different options, from each carrier. They have hundreds of different plans that have the total out-of-pocket maximum or the premium or the this and that and that. And they're like, they fluctuate drastically. And then, so.
Oh, and by the way,
you're totally right.
I think we just opened this door. We're out of time. We can go on forever with this, but now you have to go through the state. Then you have to go through the insurance companies. So now it's 2 layers. A lot of times, the state doesn't have the best, at least I'm in New York State, sorry, in my experience of customer service, and we better stop.
Yeah, in fact, this happened to me this year, so I signed up for an insurance through Marketplace, and, because of my history is very complicated. It's a pain to find a new primary care physician.
Oh, for anybody, especially you.
But like primary care just to at least fill, my sleeping meds that I need or I'll stay awake forever. And so it's like, and so I show up for my appointment, which I waited for like 2 months to see her, right? So I get there and they're like, we don't take this insurance. And I said, you are the only person I put into the system as far as to select which insurance to get was to see you. And this insurance said you were accepted. And they said, no. And then at that point I said, well, fine. Can I pay out of pocket?
Oh, they won't let you. Yes.
They wouldn't even let me pay out of pocket to see the primary care doctor that signed my disability, that did the disability for my car, I'm like, really?
This is going to get, you're going to see veins start popping out of my head. Like, it's just, yes. Oh, you have insurance? Well, you can't pay out of pocket. You can't, what?
Right. Right.
I can't even. Anyway, Jackson, never knew we were going there in terms of insurance. You never know where it's going to go. What's your website? Somebody wants to learn more?
Yeah, they can go to spacewhaletech.com. That's my main website with the consulting, the clean energy, the R&D, lab building, some car stuff. And then I have another one through the products. You can go to Everything Space Whale. I've got computers on there that can do AI, can do virtual reality, if you want to look into that. I can even do a video about it. I've built computers, and I can explain the graphics cards and why I chose those particular computers. And then there's some merchandise, with my logo on there if you want to help support.
Cool. Always great talking with you. Love your insight on all of this, and looking forward next time we catch up.
Great talking to you again.
You too,
Steve.
We'll be right back.
Have a good one.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.